Black maid slept on the floor with the baby. The millionaires saw, and then this happened. The midnight silence of the Ashford mansion breaks only with soft whispers as 43-year-old Grace Williams lies on the nursery floor. Her arms wrapped protectively around 6-month-old Emma, who finally sleeps peacefully against her chest after hours of crying that expensive baby monitors couldn't soothe and trained night nurses couldn't calm with techniques that textbooks teach, but that love must provide when authentic care transcends professional competence to reach souls that recognize kindness regardless of credentials that training provides, but that character must animate if healing is to serve genuine comfort rather than just following protocols. Outside the nursery door, tech mogul David Ashford pauses in shock at witnessing devotion that money cannot purchase. His hired help sacrificing her own comfort to provide security that his daughter desperately needs, but that institutional arrangements cannot deliver when authentic maternal instinct emerges from unexpected sources to fill voids that wealth creates, but that only genuine affection can bridge when hearts recognize what minds might question, but that souls confirm through actions that speak louder than contracts, deeper than salaries, truer than any agreement that employment might establish, but that love transcends through commitment that chooses service over self despite circumstances that comfort would prefer, but that dedication willingly abandons when others need what authentic care provides. The Ashford Mansion stands as monument to success that isolation built, its 37 rooms echoing with emptiness that wealth cannot fill when accumulation becomes a substitute for connection, when material comfort replaces human warmth, when professional achievement distances its achiever from relationships, that meaning requires despite advantages that money provides, but that purpose must guide if prosperity is to serve souls rather than just satisfying appetites that consumption feeds, but never fulfills when happiness depends on sharing rather than just having, on giving rather than just receiving, on loving rather than just being loved, when authentic relationships demand reciprocity that selfishness prevents, but that generosity enables through choices that wisdom makes when hearts recognize truth that minds might question. David's empire spans continents while his personal life contracts into professional obligations that success demands, but that satisfaction eludes when achievement becomes addiction that consumes rather than fulfills, that isolates rather than connects, that accumulates recognition while losing relationships that gave success, meaning before accomplishment, became obsession rather than tool for building better life, that includes rather than excludes authentic connection when wealth serves wisdom, rather than just accumulating advantages that loneliness might purchase, but that companionship must provide if prosperity is to create happiness rather than just comfortable misery that privilege can afford, but that hearts cannot endure indefinitely without relationships that serve souls rather than just advancing status. Emma's arrival 18 months ago, through surrogate arrangement, reflected David's approach to life challenges. Problems that money can solve through transactions that convenience provides, but that authentic relationships require developing through time that business schedules rarely accommodate, through presence that professional obligations typically prevent, through emotional availability that corporate success often eliminates when priorities favor accumulation over attention, achievement over affection, profit over partnership, when souls require nurturing that success might enable, but that engagement must provide if resources are to serve human flourishing rather than just maintaining comfortable isolation. The nursery itself represents an attempt to purchase parental competence through equipment that technology provides, but that wisdom must guide. Monitors that track every breath but cannot interpret emotional needs. Cribs that cost more than most salaries but cannot provide security that presence creates. Toys that stimulate development but cannot substitute for attention that love gives freely when hearts connect despite circumstances that might complicate, but that character can navigate when authentic care emerges naturally rather than requiring training that expertise provides, but that intuition must animate if nurturing is to serve genuine development rather than just maintaining professional standards. Grace's employment began 6 months ago when previous staff proved inadequate for caring for baby whose needs exceeded standard protocols. Her background, including 3 children of her own raised while working multiple jobs that economic necessity demanded, but that experience refined into understanding that textbooks cannot teach about infant care that goes beyond feeding schedules and sleep training into emotional support that developing souls require when security depends on feeling known, rather than just managed, loved rather than just maintained, valued rather than just processed through systems that efficiency creates, but that hearts must animate if care is to serve flourishing rather than just preventing problems. Her approach to Emma differs fundamentally from previous caregivers whose professional training emphasized techniques that compliance produces, but that connection requires inspiring through relationships that understanding creates rather than just authority that position provides when trust becomes foundation for development, that fear prevents, but that safety enables through presence that commitment demonstrates rather than just competence that certification might guarantee, but that character must provide if nurturing is to serve souls rather than just meeting minimum requirements that contracts specify, but that love transcends through dedication that chooses others over self when circumstances demand sacrifice that privilege rarely requires, but that authenticity willingly provides. The evening that changes everything begins with Emma's mysterious illness that pediatricians cannot diagnose despite expensive consultations that expertise provides, but that intuition must complement when medical science reaches limits that human understanding can sometimes transcend through observation that sustained attention develops, but that casual interaction cannot provide when genuine care requires presence that professional obligations typically prevent even among highly trained specialists whose knowledge serves diagnosis, but that experience must guide toward healing that time creates rather than just treatment that procedures deliver without addressing underlying needs that souls require for thriving rather than just surviving challenges that life inevitably presents. Grace's response to Emma's distress demonstrates wisdom that motherhood taught through necessity rather than choice. Her own children having faced similar mysterious ailments that single-parent income couldn't afford diagnosing through expensive specialists, but that maternal instinct learned to address through methods that desperation developed when resources remained limited but love remained unlimited, when creativity replaced capital as tool for healing that circumstances might complicate, but that dedication could overcome through persistence that privilege rarely requires, but that adversity often teaches when survival depends on innovation rather than just purchasing solutions that money provides, but that wisdom must apply. The decision to sleep on nursery floor emerges naturally from recognition that Emma needs constant presence rather than just periodic checking that professional protocols recommend, but that genuine care transcends when authentic connection develops between souls that recognize each other despite circumstances that might suggest inappropriate attachment, but that hearts confirm through bonds that employment cannot explain, but that humanity creates when barriers dissolve through sustained interaction that mutual recognition enables despite social distance that economics maintains, but that character can bridge when love emerges naturally rather than requiring negotiation. David's discovery happens by accident during one of his rare ventures into nursery during hours when professional obligations typically prevent personal involvement. His surprise at finding Grace sleeping on floor with Emma reflects disconnection from daily realities that wealth creates when others handle practical necessities of life that privilege can avoid, but that humanity requires experiencing if understanding is to develop beyond theoretical knowledge that education provides, but that practice must refine through engagement that comfort zones typically prevent when delegation becomes habit rather than choice, when isolation becomes consequence rather than preference. The scene he witnesses challenges every assumption about employee relationships, professional boundaries, and appropriate behavior that business thinking applies to personal arrangements when transactional mindset meets authentic care that cannot be purchased but must be freely given when hearts connect despite circumstances that might complicate, but that character transcends through choices that wisdom makes rather than just following expectations that tradition maintains, but that evolution might require abandoning when transformation serves authentic development rather than just maintaining familiar arrangements that comfort provides, but that growth might require changing. Grace's gentle humming while Emma sleeps creates atmosphere of security that expensive equipment cannot replicate. Her presence providing comfort that training cannot teach, but that experience develops when necessity meets love to create competence that credentials might not recognize, but that results demonstrate through outcomes that effectiveness measures rather than just following procedures that certification requires, but that wisdom must guide if care is to serve souls rather than just meeting professional standards that contracts specify, but that authentic relationships transcend through commitment that chooses service over self when others need what genuine affection provides without expecting recognition or reward beyond satisfaction that comes from knowing someone sleeps peacefully because of sacrifice that love makes willingly. The silence that follows David's discovery stretches through mansion corridors like revelation, penetrating consciousness that business success had insulated from recognizing human needs that professional arrangements typically address through delegation that comfort provides, but that understanding requires experiencing directly when souls connect despite barriers that social position creates around authentic relationships that employment might complicate, but that character can navigate when genuine affection emerges naturally rather than requiring strategic calculation about appropriate boundaries that wisdom must establish rather than just following expectations that tradition maintains, but that circumstances might require adjusting. His retreat to study reflects need for processing implications of witnessing care that exceeds contractual obligations, devotion that transcends professional requirements, love that emerges despite employment relationships that society considers inappropriate for deep emotional connection, but that humanity requires when souls recognize kindred spirits, regardless of circumstances that might suggest boundaries, should prevent authentic affection from developing naturally through sustained interaction that mutual respect enables despite economic differences that tradition might emphasize rather than character similarities that hearts can recognize when barriers dissolve through understanding. The documents on David's desk, custody agreements, nanny contracts, household staff regulations, suddenly seem inadequate for addressing reality that authentic relationships require different framework than business transactions provide when human connection transcends employment categories to create bonds that legal language cannot capture, but that hearts recognize through actions that speak louder than contracts, deeper than salaries, truer than any agreement that professional relationships might establish, but that love creates through choices that wisdom makes when others' needs become more important than personal comfort that sacrifice willingly abandons. Emma's peaceful sleep continues through morning hours that usually bring crying that expensive interventions cannot prevent, her calm demonstrating benefits that authentic presence provides when security comes from feeling known rather than just managed, loved rather than just maintained, valued as complete person rather than just responsibility that professional competence might handle efficiently, but that genuine care must inspire through relationships that understanding creates rather than just authority that position provides when trust becomes foundation for development that fear prevents, but that safety enables through commitment that demonstrates rather than just promises reliability. The transformation in household atmosphere becomes apparent as other staff members notice difference that Grace's approach creates, not just in Emma's behavior, but an entire environment that authentic care influences when genuine affection sets tone for interactions that professionalism might guide, but that humanity must animate if work is to serve souls rather than just completing tasks that efficiency measures, but that meaning must provide through relationships that respect creates rather than just hierarchy that employment establishes when people choose connection over distance despite circumstances that might complicate, but that character can navigate. David's business obligations feel increasingly hollow as he processes contrast between success that isolation achieved and fulfillment that authentic relationships provide when souls connect despite barriers that social position creates around genuine affection that circumstances might complicate, but that wisdom can address through choices that courage makes rather than just following expectations that comfort protects but that growth might require challenging when transformation serves authentic development rather than just maintaining arrangements that privilege provides, but that purpose must guide if prosperity is to serve humanity rather than just accumulating advantages that loneliness might purchase, but that companionship must create. The conversation that must happen occurs in nursery, where Emma plays contentedly while Grace attends to duties that employment requires, but that affection has transformed from obligations into expressions of care that money cannot measure, but that hearts recognize through actions that demonstrate commitment beyond professional requirements, when authentic relationships develop despite circumstances that might suggest inappropriate attachment, but that humanity confirms through bonds that souls create when barriers dissolve through sustained interaction, that mutual recognition enables across differences, that understanding can bridge when character connects despite economic distance. David's approach reflects uncertainty about navigating territory that business school never mapped, when personal relationships intersect with professional arrangements in ways that standard protocols cannot address. When authentic connection challenges assumptions about appropriate boundaries that social position typically maintains, but that human need might require crossing, when souls recognize what minds might question, but that hearts confirm through recognition that transcends rational analysis to embrace truth that love reveals despite obstacles that tradition might present, when change threatens familiar patterns that comfort protects, but that growth might require abandoning. Grace, I need to talk to you about what I witnessed last night. David begins, his words carrying vulnerability that corporate negotiations never required when power meets authenticity. When authority encounters genuine care that cannot be commanded but must be freely given, when hearts connect despite circumstances that might complicate, but that character transcends through choices that wisdom makes rather than just following expectations that tradition maintains, but that evolution might require changing when transformation serves souls rather than just preserving arrangements that privilege might prefer, but that humanity might need altering. Her response demonstrates dignity that circumstances cannot diminish when character provides foundation that external pressures cannot shake. Mr. Ashford, Emma needed comfort that she couldn't find alone. I've raised 3 children, and sometimes what babies need most is just knowing someone cares enough to stay close when they're scared or uncertain. I hope I didn't overstep any boundaries, but I couldn't bear listening to her cry when simple presence could help. Her explanation reveals wisdom that textbooks cannot teach about human needs that go beyond professional protocols in a territory where souls require authentic connection rather than just competent service. The honesty in her voice creates a moment of recognition as David processes implications of having someone in his household whose motivation transcends employment to embrace genuine affection for daughter he loves, but whose needs often confuse him when business expertise proves inadequate for addressing emotional requirements that parenthood demands, but that experience must teach through engagement that professional obligations typically prevent when delegation becomes habit rather than choice. When comfort zone maintenance prevents learning that growth requires, when transformation serves authentic development rather than just maintaining familiar arrangements. David's response transforms their relationship from employer-employee to something unprecedented in his experience. Recognition of partnership in caring for Emma that professional boundaries might complicate, but that human need requires when souls connect despite circumstances that social position typically prevents through barriers that wisdom must cross if authentic relationships are to serve purposes greater than just maintaining comfortable distance that privilege might prefer, but that love transcends through commitment that chooses others over self when genuine affection emerges naturally rather than requiring negotiation. Grace, what you did last night. Staying with Emma, sacrificing your comfort for hers. That's not what I hired you to do. That's what mothers do. And I realize that's exactly what Emma needs. What we both need. If this house is going to become a home, rather than just an expensive place where people happen to live together without really connecting, David says, his words acknowledging transformation, that authentic care has created an environment that wealth had built, but that love must animate if prosperity is to serve souls rather than just accumulating advantages that isolation might purchase, but that companionship must provide. What follows revolutionizes not just household arrangements, but David's understanding of wealth's purpose when resources serve relationships rather than replacing them, when success enables connection rather than preventing it, when achievement becomes tool for building family rather than substitute for authentic bonds that souls require for flourishing despite material advantages that money provides, but that meaning must create through relationships that understanding guides rather than just transactions that convenience enables, when authentic partnership emerges despite circumstances that might complicate, but that character can navigate through choices that wisdom makes. Grace's role evolves from employee to family member through formal adoption process that legal language struggles to capture, but that hearts recognize through bonds that circumstances might complicate, but that affection transcends when genuine care emerges naturally rather than requiring strategic calculation about appropriate boundaries that business thinking might establish, but that love supersedes through commitment that chooses others over self when souls connect despite barriers that social position creates around authentic relationships that employment might begin, but that character must complete through dedication that sacrifice willingly provides. Emma's development accelerates dramatically when security comes from feeling genuinely loved rather than just professionally maintained. Her milestones reflecting benefits that authentic presence provides when attention exceeds accumulation as foundation for growth that children require despite material advantages that wealth can offer, but that nurturing must guide if resources are to serve human flourishing rather than just maintaining comfortable arrangements that privilege might prefer, but that purpose must direct through relationships that wisdom creates rather than just authority that position establishes. David's transformation from isolated millionaire to engaged father demonstrates what becomes possible when authentic relationships replace professional delegation as approach to family life. His business success finding new meaning when achievement serves building connections rather than just accumulating recognition. When wealth becomes tool for creating security that others can share rather than barrier that prevents sharing experiences that humanity requires for fulfillment that money cannot purchase, but that love must provide through relationships that serve souls rather than just advancing advantages. The mansion itself undergoes transformation that reflects changed priorities when spaces designed for display become areas for living authentically, when formal arrangements yield to comfortable functionality that families require, when isolation ends through choices that wisdom makes about using resources to serve connection rather than maintaining distance that privilege might prefer, but that hearts reject when genuine affection emerges through sustained interaction that mutual respect enables despite economic differences that understanding can bridge, when character connects across circumstances that might separate, but that love transcends. Grace's own children, Marcus, 16, Destiny, 14, and Lil James, 9, gradually integrate into expanded family structure that creates opportunities previously impossible when resources serve justice rather than just accumulating comfort. When wealth enables access to education and experiences that systematic barriers typically prevent, but that authentic partnership can overcome through sharing that privilege makes possible when character guides distribution of advantages that individual accumulation might hoard, but that wisdom shares when souls connect despite circumstances that might complicate, but that understanding can navigate. The community response ranges from shock to admiration as news spreads about millionaire who chose authentic family over social expectations, whose priorities shifted from accumulating status to building relationships that serve souls rather than just maintaining comfortable arrangements that tradition might protect, but that evolution requires changing when transformation serves human flourishing rather than just preserving familiar patterns that comfort might prefer, but that growth demands. Abandoning when love proves stronger than convention despite obstacles that prejudice might present, but that character can overcome through choices that courage makes. 5 years later, the Ashford household operates through rhythms that authentic families create when love guides decisions rather than just following expectations that social position might establish. Home-cooked meals replacing restaurant delivery, family game nights superseding formal entertainment, genuine conversation developing where polite performance once dominated when hearts connect despite barriers that economics might create, but that affection transcends through commitment that chooses others over self when souls recognize what authentic partnership provides despite circumstances that tradition might question, but that results validate through happiness that individual fulfillment and collective harmony produce when relationships serve humanity rather than just advancing personal advantages. The black maid who slept on the floor with the baby became the mother whose love transformed house into home, employee into family member, isolation into connection, when authentic care proved more powerful than social expectations, when character mattered more than circumstances, when hearts recognized truth that minds might question, but that souls confirmed through bonds that employment began, but that affection completed through choices that wisdom made, when others' needs became more important. Then personal comfort, when genuine partnership emerged despite barriers that prejudice might maintain, but that love dissolves through understanding that serves everyone better than separation, when families form through authentic connection rather than just legal arrangements. When home becomes sanctuary where souls flourish rather than just expensive space, where people happen to coexist without truly connecting, when hearts remain open to possibilities that tradition might deny, but that experience confirms through relationships that transcend circumstances to discover love that exists everywhere, when recognition allows authentic bonds to develop naturally.